Okay, welcome everybody. Just a couple of reminders, observations. Friday, the day of the exam, we will not have a lecture, so there's no class on Friday, but I will post, I'll just show up and post, for those of you that are on Twitch, I'll show up and just post the link to the questions, but it'll be on ELC and you'll log into ELC and do the first exam that way. Did I say quiz? I meant exam. So the exam is Friday, the first of 3, and again, it's a comparison of my take with Watson's take and a few things to think about. One of them would be, and I'll actually quote Watson with a page number, where he says something about the, for example, why the British defeat, or the British defeat the French in the colonization of the New World, or why the Spanish are eclipsed by the French and the English in the colonization of the New World. And then I'll give my explanation for it very briefly. And then your job is to sort of compare those two and think about which you think is best. And as I said before, if you repeat what I've said, you're sort of, we've failed. What I want you to do is actually consider Watson. This is, of course, an open book exam. Consider Watson's account. You can take a look at my account. That's on, all the lectures are recorded on YouTube, so you should be able to go back and look at them. And then sort of decide which is right, and there's no right or wrong answer here. Really, the solution is for you to kind of think through, make a kind of argument for which of us is correct, based on what you think is most important, what you think is most significant. It's going to be it's going to be one question. So sorry, there'll be 2 or 3 possible questions to answer, and you'll answer one of those questions. It's an essay, and that's it. That's the exam, is one essay. So the exam will be on ELC, not on a link on Twitch. I'll just mention it on Twitch, but it'll be on ELC for the exam. It will not be timed. It will, although it will close 24 hours from the time that I open it. If that makes sense. So I'll open it at about 10:20. 10:20 tomorrow, it'll be closed, and you won't be able to turn it in after that. So you have 24 hours to do it. I ask that you take about an hour to do it. It shouldn't take you longer than that. If you have ELC extensions or things like that, you could take an hour and a half or a little longer based on your ELC. All these things. But it's not ELC, it's DRC, which is different from D2L. If you have a DRC, then you could take a little bit longer to do it. So it won't be timed in the traditional sense, but you will have to turn it in, the answer, within 24 hours. There are 3 prompts, and you can choose the prompt that you want. This time, there may be only 2 prompts in the future. What questions should I be prepared to answer? How many words? It says on the syllabus how many words. What's that? 300 words. So just a little over a page. Are we allowed to use outside sources? No, I'd like you to use basically my account and the Watson's account as sources. 300 words. There is no class on Friday. There won't be a lecture, there's just the exam. The exam will open at 10:20 and it'll close at 10:20 the following day. So Friday at 10:20 until Saturday at 10:20. 300 words is around what I'm looking for. If you go over a little bit, 350 even is fine. But just to be kind of fair to everybody, I wanted to keep it in the in that 300 range. 400 is way too many, 200 is way too short. Does that make sense? So around 300 words. Narrow down the topics. So a few big questions that I've been asking in the exam are good, in the class are good ones for the exam. What allowed the Europeans to colonize the New World rather than the other way around? Why the Spanish and Portuguese are the ones that are first to colonize? What else? What allows the British to defeat the French, which is what we're still talking about now. And what is war capitalism, or to what extent does war capitalism explain American, or sort of Anglo-American predominance in this period? Financialization, which I'll talk about today, will be another good question. And I'll talk about what that is. Whoa, the questions are just... There's one exam question, you can pick between a few prompts. So that's just to give you a sense of the kinds of the big sweeping things that are likely to have been at the head of a lecture that I've given. This 300 words, somebody asked, is 300 words per question or 300 words total? It's 300 words total. You'll have 2 or 3 prompts in each of these exams, probably 3 for this exam, and you'll choose one, you'll answer that, and you'll do it in 300 words. Yes, there is pack-back this week. I don't think the exam kind of interferes with that. We've got the chapters to read to get through. Okay. Wow. Okay, and again, it's 303-126, and I'm going to go back to lecture today. Okay. So I want to talk about the British Empire's financial advantages from 1688 to the 1760s. This is a little bit of a recap. Talk about the financialization of the British Empire and what that means. Then talk a little bit about land speculation in Virginia and the conflict at what becomes Pittsburgh. And then 3 events in what's called the French and Indian War in the United States. It's called the 7 Years' War in Europe, because this is a kind of, it's a world war, really, because it's taking place in India, in the Caribbean, in Great Britain, in much of Europe, and of course in the Americas. Exam is open notes, yes. And open book. You can look back at the Watson lectures. You can also look at Watson chapters. You can also look back at my notes, my lectures. Okay. So remember again that the valuable staples, and this is my argument, and this is different from Watson's argument, is that what the real value of the New World is not all that land. For Europeans, it's really drugs that are valuable, light, and transportable. I mean, the thing about drugs is you need relatively little in terms of quantity to bring back. It's highly valuable, very difficult to produce in other places, and the ideal spot is around 10 to 15 degrees latitude. And you need, what the Europeans do is enslave Africans to do this work. They try enslaving native people. They try enslaving Indians from the northern part of the Americas and transporting them, but they end up transporting Africans all this way over to produce these commodities. And this takes place in a way that makes it possible for Europeans to make a tremendous amount of money, but their connection to the slave trade to be almost invisible. And that connection to the slave trade that's almost invisible is made possible by this, the Bank of England, in Great Britain in particular. That banks make it possible to leverage the wealth of people in the north of England to invest in slavery, to invest in the slave trade, to invest in the production of these drugs, which are then transported back to the old world. And a term that sociologists use, and I want to use here, is financialization. And what is financialization? Financialization is initially a term that comes from sociologists, and it describes the increasing importance of finance, financial markets, and financial institutions to the workings of the economy. And I would add also the empire, that these financial institutions are much more wedded to the British Empire than they are to the French, the Spanish, or the Portuguese Empire. These new financial institutions like the Bank of England. The process by which this happens is the British Empire issues consols or bonds, which people buy. People like these people, the Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, buy, or other British elites will buy, which will then pay them back over time, over a space of 10 or 20 years. The money that they acquire this way is then used to engage in the settlement, quote unquote, of the New World, and that is largely, or has a lot to do with the slave trade. It makes it possible for large numbers of Europeans to come over as indentured servants. The vast majority of Europeans that come over as indentured servants. So even if you have a, whatever, 7th great grandparent who came over on the Mayflower, it's very likely that other people in your family came over as indentured servants. And this peaks, as you can see, in the between 1711 and 1760, but it follows from this English financial revolution that makes it possible for people for the British Empire to create a large number of ships, to create a British Navy, to transport enslaved people over from Africa, and also to transport indentured servants over from Europe to the New World. This is not something that France does, it's not something that Spain does, it's not something that Portugal does. Spain and Portugal do bring slaves over, France does bring slaves over, but they don't have the kind of quantity of enslaved people that they bring over as the British do. And this has everything to do with these financial markets. Britain is a very poor country in the 1650s. It becomes increasingly wealthy as it leverages these financial markets to make money in, not just in the New World, but also in India. In the 1800s, it'll use that leverage in China. Inside that financial network, though, and this is important for understanding the revolution, inside that financial network, though, are New England traders who increasingly figure out how this system works. These New England traders, I said English traders, these New England traders, ironically, descendants of dissidents, these merchants, New England merchants are the descendants of old dissidents like Quakers and Pilgrims and Puritans. These New England merchants figure out how to wedge themselves in to this financial network. There's a system called mercantilism that all the European empires are engaged in, which are basically designed to get raw materials from the New World and bring them to the Old World. But these New England merchants, often secretly, help create a financial network that changes the triangle, so that increasingly New England merchants are the ones capturing and enslaving people in West Africa. bringing them over to the Caribbean or to the United States, or Caribbean or the North American colonies. And what they provide are the goods that those Caribbean colonies need and goods that African traders are willing to accept. Manufactured goods. Rum as well. Someone asked me to repeat the definition of financialization, and that is the increasing importance of finance, financial markets, and financial institutions in the economy. There was a question. The 1650 British was poor, but has these financial what? These financial. So someone is, I think, asking me to explain something I said. All right. In 1650, Britain was poor, but these financial networks and these financial institutions allowed them to get rich. Does that make sense? I hope. Okay. Now I want to set up the central conflict between the British Empire and the French Empire for the control of the Americas. And that period is roughly from the 1750s to the 1760s, the peak of that, which sets up the French and Indian War, what's going to be called the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. All right. The English and the English colonists claim that because of the Treaty of Utrecht, they can defend the rights of native people against the French. And this is a conflict that took place between France and other European nations. And in that contract, it says something like the British can represent native people against the French. Someone asked if I could elaborate more on mercantilism. That's a couple of lectures back, but mercantilism is basically the use of colonies to provide you raw materials and sending manufactured goods back to those colonies. And mercantilism is basically a series of laws that make it illegal for the New World to send manufactured goods to the Old World, for example. Is this test all about comparing what you say versus Watson? Not really. That it's really to sort of your sort of stink test, if you will, about which you think is right. You'll have a little bit more with Watson than me, because mostly what you have is lectures from me. But it will generally be about this thing, but you'll kind of answer the question. Okay. The increasing financialization of the English Empire allowed rapid population growth in all the colonies, but especially the southern colonies after 1700. And that's back to this chart here. So we do see that, say, between 1750 and 1759, there are 40,000 people that come over from mostly indentured servants from into the port of Philadelphia. In that same period, roughly 52,000 African enslaved people. 1740 to 1749, we see a total of what, 27,000? 27,000. In that same period, 25,000. But then in 1730, 22,000 versus 75,000. So in general, the southern colonies grow more quickly in terms of population than northern colonies, but both British colonies, northern and southern colonies, grow tremendously. Now, when we look at maps, many maps have the British and the French, but it's important to understand what's happening in the native communities to the west. And here there's conflict with the rise and increasing power of what's called the Iroquois. And the Iroquois are these 6 groups, the 6 nations. They're mostly in what's now New York. upstate New York. And a covenant chain of treaties from 1715 to 1763 links the Iroquois nations to the fate of the British. As the Iroquois nations see it, the biggest threat is the French, because the French are missionizing people in native communities, sending out Christian missionaries who lead groups to secede or escape from the Iroquois Empire. The Iroquois is a kind of somewhat hierarchical, I say empire, somewhat hierarchical covenant. It's not an empire in the Inca sense or the Maya sense, but the Iroquois do capture people who they don't or are unfamiliar with, and make them cousins to a certain extent. Sometimes torture them, sometimes kill them. But that's not the important thing. Is for the Iroquois is they want to settle on this land. The Iroquois live in longhouses. They're growing their own food. They engage in trade. The people who resent them, though, are the Algonquin. And this is a very rough image, but the Algonquins are Algonquin-speaking people, but they're also form their own community against the Iroquois. They see the Iroquois as being bullies, as having English guns, which allow them to dominate the East Coast. There have been Algonquins that have been living there for years, but many Algonquins and people in this Algonquin Confederacy are people that have been broken up or driven away by the Iroquois who are demanding territory. So it's complicated, the relationship between these two groups of people. There are separate language groups, but there are also political issues that divide the Algonquin and in the West and the Iroquois in the East. We can generally say that the Iroquois favored the British, and generally say that the Algonquins favored the French. The Iroquois called these Algonquins far Indians. The Algonquins called the Iroquois slaveholders. And that's too strong a term, but it is true that the Iroquois Confederacy was not very friendly to other groups in the West. In general, the Iroquois planted, and in general, the Algonquin hunted. Algonquins tended to live in mobile sites that look a little bit like teepees. Iroquois tended to live in long houses. And again, the Iroquois is not one group, it's six different nations that were bound together in the Iroquois. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's important to understand this because as the Algonquins see it, the Iroquois are basically arming themselves and pushing their way into Algonquin regions. As the Iroquois view it, the Algonquins are people who are kind of less than themselves, and also renegades, some of whom have converted to Roman Catholicism. This is the French view, and it's not wrong, about who controls the New World. And as you can see, the British have wedged themselves onto the East Coast, but the French have dominated the St. Lawrence and the upper Mississippi with their Algonquin allies. There's some important differences. The French traders who are in Louisiana, and traders and farmers who are in Louisiana Territory and up in on both sides of the Great Lakes are a much smaller number. There's about 50,000 of them. And they are kind of living with Algonquin or communicating regularly with Algonquin traders who are bringing them in this sort of exchange system, bringing hides and other things which will eventually be exported to France. Crucial, though, is control of rivers and portages across the lakes. Portages are places where you pick up a canoe and move it a little bit further as you're traveling and trading. And so there's this chain of Great Lakes trade in, you see, not with Lake Michigan, but Superior, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. And the Iroquois control trade over the Ontario. Algonquins are, and the French are more powerful on Lake Erie and Lake Huron. And of course, the French control the St. Lawrence River. It's crucial to understand that rivers are everything. The Ohio River and the Mississippi River are in the power of the French. And why is this important? Well, there aren't good roads. Most communication takes place by flatboat along rivers, or in canoes between, is that me? Yeah, down a little bit. Okay. What tribes control what lakes? Let me go back. In general, the Iroquois controlled Ontario and Lake Erie. In general, the Algonquin controlled Superior and Huron. Okay. So this trade up and down the Ohio and the Mississippi River is crucial for the French. The French have a small colony in New Orleans, which is providing food to its vital colony, particularly Saint-Domingue, Sandomingue, will later be called Haiti. Okay. The English governor's view, though, English Governor Dinwiddie in Virginia, his view is that if we, the British, can just get control of the Ohio River, which is south of the Great Lakes, then this will allow us to settle in this region and to trade down the Mississippi River. And so for this reason, Governor Dinwiddie sends out a young colonel named George Washington to a crucial corner between the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and the Ohio River. That's right at that, see that hook there on the edge? The little, the very end of what looks like the Ohio River here? The northern and southern, the place where the three rivers meet is Pittsburgh. When one of my books got turned into a musical, they performed it in Pittsburgh, and I got invited to watch the performance, and so I traveled in Pittsburgh, and I traveled around and basically invited myself into hotels along Pittsburgh so I could find a good spot to take a picture out the window. And this is what I got. The Ohio River to the west, Allegheny and the Monongahela meet there. So as you can see, this point would be crucial for control of this region. So So Americans want to break into this region. They look to where the Monongahela meets the Allegheny to form the Ohio River. The Ohio River is 1,000 miles long from that pinch point to the Mississippi River, almost 1,000 miles. The Ohio Valley is 204,000 square miles. Right? So what's now Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois are all part of that Ohio Valley. Land speculators in Virginia hope to establish a fort that will control the Ohio country. And the company calls itself the Ohio Company. And they're the ones who asked the governor to send out a party to support the Ohio Company. I'm sorry, is that me? I have a question. Governor Dinwiddie's view is that this is 204,000 acres of land, very valuable land in this valley, which can be, and we're back to financialization again, sold to settlers if they can just possess it and take it from the people who are in this region. And and so that's the attraction, is to be able to sell this land, to parcel out and sell this land in the Ohio River Valley. When 1754, when Washington arrives, he discovers that the French have already begun to build a fort, Fort Duquesne, in what will become Pittsburgh. For the French, defending this river base against speculators, land speculators, means defending a whole fort-based river trading system with Indians that extends from New Orleans, all the way to Lakes Huron and Michigan. For the Iroquois Confederacy, the English expansion is frightening, but they also dislike the French, as I said, in large part for missionizing and taking people away from their communities. The French view was, defending this river-based trading system, which was somewhat profitable to France. Washington was only 22 years old. His men meet with Tanna Grisson, Tanagrisson. He's also called the Half King. And when he meets with them, he doesn't realize that when Washington meets with Tanna Grisson, he doesn't realize that Tanna Grisson is planning an ambush. So he tells the British where the French fort is. The French line up and on a bluff overlooking this French fort early in the morning. And no one knows who fired the first shot, but it basically becomes this first battle in 1754. The British kill most of the French soldiers in this fort. And the British are on this bluff. The French are down here. They're just waking up. The British are already awake. And so it's basically a charnel house. It's deadly. The French surrender. The British come in. And they're making a treaty to establish who has control of Pittsburgh. And Tanna Grisson identifies the French commander who's making the treaty, establishing the treaty. He's lying down, he's partially wounded. And Tanna Grisson bends over and says, "Tu n'es pas encore mort, mon père." You are not dead yet, my father. And cuts his head open with a tomahawk and soaks his hand in the French colonel's brains. This starts a war between France and Britain that will last 7 years. It will spread to the Caribbean, to India, and Europe, and it starts in Pittsburgh. While this conflict is going on, here's Fort Duquesne. And here's Washington. And here's the hastily assembled Fort Necessity. In 1755, the French counterattack, and they wipe out Fort Necessity, this British fort. Washington organizes the retreat and saves some of his men and becomes a kind of hero for the British for having saved them. The British view in the French-Indian War is that the French are kind of trying to control or dominate the Ohio Valley, and the Ohio Valley is promised to them. It's not clear from the treaties who is supposed to have authority in that region. Albany Congress in 1754, the Iroquois meet with the British colonists and establish a treaty. Benjamin Franklin tries to go beyond these treaties, trying to get the colonists to unite, but it fails. Oh, sorry, that's 1757, so that's a couple days, this is after, 1757 is the Fort William Henry Massacre. Oh, that's another massacre. Okay. The war starts badly at first, but William Pitt kind of mobilizes British resources using this sort of financialization. Pitt pledges that this war will be at His Majesty's expense. The larger global strategy is to pay Prussian armies to hold off France and Spain in Europe, and then use English soldiers in the New World to wipe out the French colony. The focus is on the long supply line down the St. Lawrence River to the Ohio. There are many skirmishes in the French and Indian War, atrocities on both sides. In 1758, British officials promised the Iroquois Confederacy that the Crown would agree upon clear and fixed boundaries within our settlements so that each party may know their own and be a mutual protection. By 1758, British and American forces together eliminate French outposts in New York, and this prevents French resupply of its western posts. How does Pitt do this? He does it with consuls. He does it with bonds. He issues a lot of bonds to fight this war, and he says it at His Majesty's expense, but it's not. This expense will be borne over the next 20 years by increasing taxes. But he's able to raise a lot of money very quickly. And so I'll finish by talking about the death of General Wolfe in the Plains of Abraham in Quebec City. And there's a painting that captures it, but bear with me here for a second. General Wolfe is, the Quebec City is a perfect place for an assault. It seems impossible to climb up to the Plains of Abraham for the British. The French control Quebec City, and that's really their crucial linchpin for the entire French control of North America. General Wolfe, with his sailors, sails up and down the St. Lawrence looking for a way into Quebec City, which had high, jagged cliffs. He sees women drying laundry on the north shore, and he sees the same laundry a couple of days later further down. And so he goes back and forth, he has men go back and forth where the laundry is, and they discover that the laundry is obscuring a little path that leads straight uphill to the Plains of Abraham. He sends out 3 parties to throw off French troops and then sends assault craft to the pathway to the plains. This small corps climbs 180 feet. And then marches others back to the spot. By the next day, 4,000 troops are stationed above Quebec City. And Quebec City is taken by 1760. This historical painting, The Death of General Wolfe, is a historical painting. We can read it from left to right. Oh, sorry. From right to left, and then down, and from left to right. That's how you read historical paintings, right? So historical paintings like this tell a story of multiple events, but you have to kind of read them this way. Okay, so what happens? On the right, on the upper right, you can see their ships arriving and climbing the steep cliffs to behind the, in the center there, to behind the French troops. On the left at the top, you see the battle that takes place. And then, as we move down, we see a ranger who is familiar with Indian ways and but also English. And he's pointing back and he's saying, "They run." Because the British have defeated the French on the Plains of Abraham. This native person is like 1,000 miles away from where he's supposed to be. This is an Ohio Indian, not anywhere near this, but the person who painted it didn't know. So he just found a little bit like that. There's this Georgia painting, the Georgia statue that just went up that's also completely impossible. And then General Wolfe, who is in charge of the attack, does die at the very end of the attack. And so this is the apotheosis, the kind of climbing to God for General Wolfe. And the flag, as you see, kind of suggests this sort of his ascent to heaven. And his arms are stretched out in a way that resembles Christ. And so, but not too closely, but this would be a familiar image to many people. So this is a Mohawk chief. They didn't fight on the side of the British, although they did fight with the British in Ohio. Okay, what's this effects of this war for England in 1763? Britain wins this worldwide war in 1763 after the defeat of the French at Quebec City. England's national debt doubles, or nearly doubles. And the cost of policing this huge region explodes for the British. So, what it does lead to is a sort of the French evacuating, or French troops anyways, evacuating from this region. French people are still there, of course. A tremendous debt burden for England. And so some of these people, you're familiar, some of them are moved to New Orleans, called the Cajuns. They were Acadians. They moved. There are, of course, many French speakers in Quebec now. They're the descendants of those French settlers. But this becomes a British North America, basically after 1763. So the war between the British and the French is over, at least for North America. A tremendous debt burden for England. And number three, there's no middle ground now between a three-sided war, between kind of native people on one side, if you will, British and French on the other. I talked about the Algonquins and the Iroquois, and so there were differences. But the Algonquins and the Iroquois were both ambivalent about the power of the French and the British in their region. And they have the ability to play one group off against the other. And that goes away after 1763. And Britain will turn against its allies, the Iroquois, in the 1770s and 1780s. Now, it's not a foregone conclusion that Britain would get North America. And in fact, Britain was given the choice at the war conclusion in 1763 of either taking Guadeloupe and Martinique, tiny little islands, or North America east of the Mississippi. That's how unimportant this was. There are plenty of people here, but it's unimportant to the British Empire, really. Guadeloupe and Martinique are massively important, right? Tiny little islands, because they produce these drugs that are going to the old world. But the Americas east of the Mississippi at the time doesn't provide much. Tobacco, yes, but other than that, it's not that important for the larger British Empire, as the larger British Empire sees it. And there's no American interest, right? The West Indies interests, right? The people who have those islands, who own the land in those islands, are right next to Parliament. They have the ear of the king. So what began as land speculation became a worldwide war. But would speculation in Western lands stop after British subjects now had a justification for further land grabs? The end of the war laid the groundwork for the collapse of the North American part of the British Empire, because the cost of this war would be borne mostly by the North American colonists, and they would resent it. Financialization was a system that was designed to tax people after you take things. And that taxation will be the point of contention between the British and the North American colonies. All right, thanks so much. See you guys on Wednesday.
Thanks, Professor Nelson.
Thank you.